Chess YouTube, what is happening? So, on July 8th, 2025, Magnus Carlsen, the GOAT, you know him, you love him, he invented a brand new chess opening that I'm calling the Norwinglish variation. Now, his opponent, the very strong GM, Luca Moroni Jr., let's just call him Moro. He opens 1c4, the English, and Magnus goes e5, the King's English. So far, so good. Now, knight c3, pressuring d5, developing very good stuff. And Magnus on move 2, he plays the move a5. A5, a weird pawn move, and according to the chess-based database on your screen right now, this has never been played before by titled players. No national master, IM, or GM has ever played this move, making this at the GM level certainly a brand new chess opening. How does Magnus keep doing? I don't know. And by the way, Magnus Carlsen is Norwegian, and this is the English opening, so I'm calling it the Norwinglish variation. Get it? Norwegian, English. Anyway, here we go. In the Norwinglish variation, white goes g3 and Magnus bishop b4, transposing back to somewhat more normal territory. White going for the classical g3 fianchetto, and black going for sort of a reversed Rosolimo style setup where a5 actually makes some sense in the position. Now, white does go knight d5, chasing the bishop, but to black's benefit, a5 here is actually sort of a useful move, and black does not have to move the bishop. The point being, if white ever takes on b4, black captures towards the center, which would be a good exchange for black. Now, of course, black would lose the bishop pair, but on the other hand, black would get the new b pawn closer to the center, plus the open a file for the rook, and overall, that would be to black's benefit. All right, now, Magnus, knight f6, and from here, both sides play some very natural moves. We have bishop g2, castles, no surprises there. Now, white goes e3, a solid idea, preparing ideas like knight to e2 and d4 fighting for the center. So far, so good. And here, Magnus decides it is time to trade the knight on d5. So we have knight takes d5, then c takes, and then c6 counterattacking on d5, a typical move, and beyond that, trying to blunt the light squared bishop on the long diagonal. Now from here, white goes a3, driving back that bishop. We have bishop to the e7 square, then knight to e2, and from here, this is where Magnus sets the board on fire. Here, there are a lot of options you can develop. You can go, say, knight to a6, or perhaps d6, knight d7, bishop to, I don't know, g4 ideas, queen d7 ideas, bishop h3, even h5 makes sense. But instead, Magnus Carlsen, he eschews all of those ideas, and instead plays the very aggressive idea of f5. Magnus here bringing the fight to black. Here we go. All right, from here, white castles. Castles is the move, a logical developing move, and now black, knight to a6. Now, there is that saying, the knight on the rim is dim. However, and by the way, they say that because on the edge of the board, the knight only controls a few squares compared to, let's say, in the center, where it does control 8. So the knight simply controls fewer squares on the edge of the board, and those squares tend to be somewhat less important. But of course, in this variation, the knight may go to, say, c7 or c5, and because the center is sort of closed, there aren't too many open lines of attack here for either side. Because of that, the knight on a6 actually is decently placed. Now from here, white does go b4, gaining space, and this move at first glance is actually quite shocking. It's even more shocking it was played in a blitz game. So Moro here, Moro 182, what is he doing? What is the idea? After all, black here can take on b4 twice and win the pawn. Well, first of all, if you capture twice with the knight like this, then you lose the rook on a8. You don't want to do that. And beyond that, if you take with the bishop here, the response from white is queen to b3 with the attack on the bishop plus the discovered attack on the king, sort of. For example, white could threaten d takes c5, opening up the check on the king and so on, and things could get dicey very, very fast. So when white played b4 here, he recognized all of this. First of all, capturing twice with the knight is no bueno, mi amigo. Beyond that, of course, if black takes with the bishop, then queen b3 is just devastating. Therefore, white here I mean, playing really, really good chess versus this new opening, the Norwenglish variation, which, let's face it, no one saw coming in this game. All right, from here, Magnus, knight c7, not taking the bait. He retreats and pressures d5, a good move overall. And now white does have to do something about the pressure on the pawn on d5. What does white do? Well, he goes queen to b3 anyway, by far, the best square for the queen, again, with all kinds of ideas. For example, now, d6 is being threatened. If black wastes a move, like, I don't know, rook to a7, then d6 literally wins the game on the spot as you win one of these pieces. The two pieces are under attack, as is the king via the discovered attack like this. So that would be simply crushing right here. Now, instead, in the game, black goes king to h8, a good move, obviously. Getting the king out of the way of any sort of future discovered attack, it's hard to go wrong with that move. Now, white does go bishop b2, developing and pressuring e5, logical idea, and black bishop to f6. Now we have knight c3, the knight rerouting all the way from g1 to e2, and then c3, where it does control d5 and e4. And Magnus here, he decides the time has come to close the center and commit to a more fixed pawn structure with the move e4. So, Magnus here trying to clamp down on these weakened light squares. Of course, whenever you go, for example, e3 plus g3 like this, these moves obviously weaken all of these light squares on the king side and in the center, and therefore the move e4 clamps down on these two squares in particular. Now, white goes d3, trying to counterattack, trying to pressure e4, a good idea. The threat now is simply taking twice on e4. You take with the first pawn, then with the second pawn, and you win the pawn. So Moro making some very solid threats so far in this game. The pawn sack b4, queen b3 threatening the fork, d3 threatening the pawn on e4. So Moro playing very aggressive chess so far. How will Magnus respond? Well, he ignores the pawn on e4, at least for now, and instead captures on d5 like this. Now, what's the idea? It's simple. White takes on d5, but then black inserts the intermediate move. If you capture on d5 right away, white takes back with the queen, and white is crushing. Instead, Magnus here, he spots the intermediate idea. Bishop takes b2. Magnus Carlsen studying his simple elementary tactics here. Bishop takes, then queen takes, and then c takes d5. So the bishop trade deflects the queen away from b3. It now no longer controls d5. Therefore, black takes back on d5, and very importantly, controls e4 with the pawn. Very well done by Mr. Goat. Now, queen d4, the queen centralizes, and then we have queen to f6. Magnus here offering the queen trade. When you are the goat of endgames, offering a queen trade certainly always makes some sense. And very importantly here, Magnus, in this new opening, the Norwenglish variation, black here has literally more than an extra minute on the clock versus his opponent. So Magnus here, I mean, besides being the best endgame player ever, arguably, he also has more time on the clock. Things are not looking good for Moro in this game. But overall, Moro, I gotta say, playing a really solid game versus Magnus so far. All right, we have queen takes f6, and then, queen takes f6. By the way, if you take on d5 like this, that would not be the best idea in the world. Black can just take on b4 and then perhaps go somewhere else, threatening this pawn on b4 later. So that wouldn't be the strongest idea per se. Instead, queen takes f6 played in the game. Going for the trade, now we have rook takes, and then here, Moro, how do you want to proceed? Right now, the endgame is roughly even. It's, black has this space advantage here in the center. He's also up one pawn. However, white has decent pressure on the queen side. His bishop is a little better. Black's bishop on c8 is kind of weak. The rook on a8 also kind of trapped in by his own pieces right now. So white's down a pawn, but he also has a decent amount of activity and some decent targets, all of these pawns being at least a little bit weak here. So what does he do? Well, the computer gives b5 here, maintaining all the tension, trying to keep more pawns on the board, also trying to limit the scope of this rook. Now, of course, rook to a6 ideas are not possible, and so on, and white would have decent compensation for that missing pawn. Instead, in the game, rook f to c1 played, which looks logical enough, especially in blitz, controlling the open c file. However, there are some flaws with this move. From here, Magnus, he simply goes king to g8, getting his king centralized closer to the middle of the board. Now, white does go b5 here, and black goes d6. Okay, finally opening up the scope of this bishop, maybe intending bishop d7. That would look logical to me. Now, white goes f3, trying to break on the king side, but this may be a little bit of a weakening move. All right, now we have e takes d3, then rook c3, pressuring d3, and then d4. Very interesting. All right, Magnus here getting his pawns off those light squares. He knows in light squared bishop endgames, you want all of your pawns, if possible, if reasonable, if it works, on dark squares to minimize the number of targets your opponent's bishop can target. Now, we have e takes d4, and then another really good move by the GOAT, f4, pushing yet another pawn on the dark squares, and also fixing white's pawn on f3 on a light square where it's a target, first of all, but beyond that, it also limits the scope of the bishop. Magnus here, finding a way to activate his bishop while hemming in the opponent's. Just trademark Carlsen chess here, activating his pieces and limiting the activity of his opponents. Now, we have rook takes d3, then bishop d7, pressuring the pawn on b5. Logical idea. Rook c3. White giving up this pawn, maybe in exchange for rook c7 ideas. Let's see how it plays out. We have bishop takes b5, then rook c7. The rook flies in, pressures b7. The rook officially achieves pig status. Of course, the rook on the 7th rank is often called a pig. I believe Aaron Nimzovich, the inventor of the Nimzo Indian defense opening, I believe he coined the term a pig, but I could be wrong on that. Comment down below if I am wrong. And now rook to f7 defending. Now we have rook takes and king takes, then g takes f4, and then bishop c6 defending b7. And black here is just crushing. Despite being down a pawn, white's pawns on the king side are super, super weak. And beyond that, the bishop on g2 is just incredibly passive. Magnus here, again, being down a pawn, but just strategically dominating the game so far. Now, white goes rook b1. Then we have b5, gaining space. Bishop f1, and then rook to b8. So white does have a little bit of pressure on b5 in this new opening, the Norwenglish variation, but overall black here is still in complete control. Now, we have bishop to c4 check, hitting the king. Of course, you cannot take the bishop. If you do, rook takes b8, wins the piece and the game. Now, king to f6, we have king f2, and then b4, gaining even more space. We have a takes, and then rook takes b4. Now, of course, if white takes the rook on b4 like this, black takes back, and black suddenly has the very strong pass pawn on b4. Black would be effectively winning the game sooner or later. Instead, rook c1 is the move, and then finally, this pawn, it went to a5 literally on move 2, and finally it does begin its march down the board once again. a4 is the move, gaining space. The pass pawn must be pushed. Now, we have bishop g8 pressuring h7. A good move. Rook b6 defending the bishop, rook to e1, and then bishop d7. Now, white here does take on h7. We have bishop takes h7, and then bishop to e6, trying to escort the pawn down the board, controlling the a2 square. Now, rook to a1, rook b2, king to e3, and then rook to a2. A good move, of course, if you trade rooks. The rooks very often in endgames are important for the defending side. I do increase the drawing chances. So, if black here can get rid of one pair of rooks, his odds of winning the game, as he is essentially ahead here, would increase dramatically. Of course, Muro, he knows that. He's a strong GM. He goes rook c1, sliding over, and then we had the move a3, gaining even more space on the queen side. Now, rook c3 slides up and pressures the pawn, but this move is pretty weak because it simply gives up the pawn on h2, and once you take the pawn, you also have the attack on the bishop. Of course, white here down to 3 seconds, so no surprise there. He's not finding the best moves in time pressure. We have rook takes h2, winning the pawn and pressuring the bishop. Now, rook takes a3, and then rook takes h7. Black here now being up a piece. Of course, white in time trouble, making some unforced errors or perhaps forced by Magnus. Now, rook to a6, then d5, and from here, really, the game is just the GOAT cleaning up. So we'll blitz through these moves. Rook to a7, king, rook h1, rook a6, and then g6. Now rook b6, rook c1, rook to a6, rook c3, hits the king with the discovered attack on the pawn on this, sorry, not discovered, the x-ray attack on the pawn on f3. Now king d2 and then king d7, rook b6, bishop f5, rook b7 hits the king, king d6, rook b6 hits the king again, king c7, rook f6, and then finally rook b3. The rook simply slides over, and Moro here spending more than 3 seconds on the clock. I guess he wasn't sure what to do. And ultimately, he runs out of time in a completely losing position. So, what a game by Magnus in the brand new chess opening I'm calling the Norwinglish variation. Again, combination of Magnus being Norwegian plus the English opening, Norwinglish variation makes sense in my head. And again, has been played before, but never by title players, by white or as black. So effectively at the GM level, a brand new chess opening. So sue me if I'm wrong. Comment down below what you thought of the game, what you thought of the new opening. And by the way, this video is sponsored by me, Dr. Mike Chess, aka Dr. Mike Jansen. If you made it this far, I have an announcement. And it's sort of an announcement of an announcement. And it is this. Things feel different. The tides are shifting. Something new is coming. If you think you might know what that means, comment down below. That's all I'm saying for now. And as always, I wish you the best of luck in your chess improvement journey in 2025 and beyond. And I'll see you in the next video.